into Week 13 of the fantasy football season. He has a few running backs I'd look to get on the wire this week. The first guy, Dontrell Hilliard of the Tennessee Titans. I mentioned Hilliard as a pickup last week, and he blew up once again in this ball game in Week 12 versus the New England Patriots. 12 carries, 131 rush yards, a touchdown, and 2 receiving yards and a fumble loss. So he's shown in this ball game he definitely can run between the tackles and take on a big workload, even though I know he had a 68-yard touchdown in this ball game as Hilliard. But now, since the 2 games he's appeared off the practice squad, he's had 15 or more fantasy points. I know Week 13 is a bye for this Tennessee Titan team, but this guy's not going to go nowhere. Him and Donta Foreman are going to be the 2 backs over there, especially with Adrian Peterson gone, especially Jeremy McNichols has been banged up, and he hasn't played over the last few weeks. And in my opinion, Hilliard's taken on McNichols' role, and Foreman, he's been solid as well, who I'm going to mention later in this video as a pickup as well. So right here, because he's getting the job done, and he's available in 71% of fantasy leagues. The next running back's Matt Breida of the Buffalo Bills. So I mentioned Breida as a pickup last week as well, and he had a pretty decent ball game, in my opinion, versus the New Orleans Saints in Week 12. And Zach Moss, he was a healthy scratch in that one. And Breida, obviously, he might have moved up the depth chart now over Singletary and Moore. So in Week 12 at New Orleans, 9 carries, 26 yards, 2 catches, 29 yards, and a touchdown. So Breida, we know he was good in his San Francisco 49er days. And now the last 3 games here, he's produced. Week 10 at the Jets, 3 carries, 28 yards, a touchdown, 3 catches, 22 yards, a touchdown, a fumble loss. Week 11 versus the Colts, in that one, 5 carries, 51 yards, a catch for 16 yards. And then Week 12, like I mentioned, at the Saints, he had a good one on Thanksgiving night, 9 carries, 26 yards, 2 catches, 29 yards, and a touchdown. So right here, Week 13, what an AFC East matchup this is going to be with the Bills and the New England Patriots. And the Patriots give up the 13th most fantasy points to running backs. And we just saw the Patriots come off a ball game where they gave up over 200 yards rushing to Hilliard and Donta Foreman in that one, when they knew Ryan Tannehill really didn't have weapons at the receiving corps. So right here, I think Breida can have a good game versus New England. He's a dual threat out of the backfield with his receiving ability, and I like him as a pickup this week. And he's available right now in still 77% of fantasy leagues. The next running back I look to get this week's Donta Foreman of the Tennessee Titans. So right here, Foreman and Hilliard, it was a great 1-2 combo, like I mentioned, in Week 12 versus the Patriots, even though they got blown out in that ball game, 36-13, and Foreman actually was dropped in 16% of fantasy leagues going into Week 12. But now he's got to be added. I know they got a bye week in Week 13, but he had a good ball game versus the Pats. 19 carries, 109 yards, and a catch for 3 yards with a fumble loss. So right here, him and Hilliard are the 2 men over there splitting, it looks like. I know they run by. McNichols might get back into the good graces, but in my opinion, these 2 guys have ran away with the backfield. And then we're confident as well as Mike Vrabel and this Tennessee Titan front office to let Adrian Peterson go with Foreman and Hilliard outperforming. So right here, once he comes back in Week 14 off the bye, he's got a great matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. And with him available in 54% of fantasy leagues, he's definitely worth an add this week. The next running back's Boston Scott of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Jim Howard, he was out in this ball game here for the Eagles, but Boston Scott filled in well, even though I know he had a costly fumble loss in this one. And Miles Sanders had a mediocre game, but anyway, Scott got 15 carries, 64 rush yards, a touchdown, and 2 catches for 8 yards with the mentioned fumble loss. So Scott here, as long as he gets opportunity, he definitely produces. And over the last few weeks here, the opportunities went down until the Week 12 matchup with the Giants. Week 10 at Denver, 11 carries, 81 yards, 2 catches, 24 yards. Then Week 11 versus the Saints, only 6 carries, 16 yards, 2 catches for 2 yards. But then a good matchup at the Giants. He did good, like I mentioned. And in Week 13, he's got the matchup of all matchups at the New York Jets that give up the most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So right now, Scott's available in 81% of fantasy leagues. And after a pretty solid performance like this, he's definitely worth a pickup on the waiver wire this week. And the 5th and final running back I look to get on the waiver wire this week's Alexander Madison of the Minnesota Vikings. So right here, Dalvin Cook went down and he got carted off with a nasty shoulder injury in a crazy hit he took in late in that ball game versus the San Francisco 49ers in the Week 12 loss for the Vikings. So right now, Madison, we know he's one of the best backup running backs in all of pro football. And when this guy gets a lot of touches and starts, obviously, he puts up the huge numbers. So Madison, in the few games he started this season, Week 3 versus Seattle, 26 carries, 112 rush yards, 6 catches, 59 yards. Week 5 versus Detroit, 25 carries, a buck 13, 7 catches, 40 yards, a receiving touchdown, and a fumble loss. And then in relief here in Week 12 at San Francisco for Cook, 7 carries, 21 yards, a rushing touchdown, and 2 catches, 7 yards. So Week 13, if Cook's out, obviously, this guy's the pickup of the week with an amazing matchup at the Detroit Lions that give up the third most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So Madison's out there in 51% of fantasy leagues. If we get a timetable for how long Cook is out, this guy's going to be the top pickup this week. So that's a few running backs I'd look to get on the waiver wire for Week 13 of the fantasy football season.